The gauze restocked itself at 2 a.m., neat squares of white arranged in ascending columns like a prayer no one listened to anymore. Sarah Chen's hands moved through the motion without her mind's permission, 7 years of muscle memory from another life, another place, another name that didn't exist in hospital records. Her fingers pressed each package into place with the kind of precision that made people nervous if they bothered to notice, which they didn't. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial swallowed people whole and forgot their names by morning. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby above her head as she worked the supply closet, her movements flowing with the terrible grace of someone who had done harder things in darker places. The antiseptic smell coating everything, walls, floors, her scrubs, couldn't quite mask the memory of desert sand and diesel fuel and things she'd been ordered to forget. Her badge clipped to her waistband read RN in clinical blue letters, the current version of Sarah Chen, the version the hospital system had approved 3 years ago when she arrived in Norfolk with forged references and a story that didn't ask questions. She was restocking the third shelf when she heard the commotion downstairs. Not emergency commotion, the coded kind she'd learned to read. Controlled chaos. Military precision in how the hospital doors had been opened, the way footsteps coordinated instead of scattered. She didn't pause. Pausing drew attention. Attention drew scrutiny. Scrutiny was the one thing her carefully constructed life couldn't survive. The voice crackled over the intercom at 02 for 7 hours. Post-op transfer arriving cardiac unit. Sergeant Major Roberts, USMC, routine monitoring. Surgical team escort incoming. Her hand froze on a package of 4x4 gauze pads. One moment of stillness. That was all she allowed herself. Then her fingers resumed their work, pressing the pads into alignment with the kind of control that came from training most people would never understand. Sergeant Major David Roberts. She knew that name the way you know the name of someone who had written to you every 2 weeks for 18 months, letters folded into military envelopes, containing updates about a person you'd created but weren't allowed to claim. Her son. David Chen Roberts, because she'd given him her original name before she gave him to his father, before the operation in Tikrit went so catastrophically wrong that the entire unit had been erased from official records. Before she was given a new name and a new social security number and an order never to surface again. The lights in the supply closet seemed to dim when she thought about it. She finished restocking in silence. By the time Sarah pushed her cart to the cardiac unit, Sergeant Major Roberts was already settled in Bay 4, his massive frame taking up most of the hospital bed, chest wrapped in white bandages under a thin gown. 2 Marines in dress blue stood at attention inside the room, honor escort, the kind of ceremonial presence that meant the patient was significant. His chart sat clipped to the foot rail, 62 years old, post-op day 3 from emergency aortic valve replacement, vital stable, chest drain patent, standard post-surgical monitoring protocol. He was sleeping, his breathing deep and even, the kind of sleep that came from pain medication and the righteous exhaustion of a man accustomed to command. Sarah's hand steady as she entered the room, her eyes fixed on the 4 lines and monitor leads, anywhere but his face. She began her rounds with the methodical precision that made her invisible, checking the chest drain, noting the serous output, verifying the medication labels against the physician orders. The Marines watched her work with the neutral attention of men trained to notice everything and comment on nothing. She moved like she'd been trained to move, efficient, quiet, leaving no trace. Her scrubs whispered against the tile floor. The drain was clean. No clotting. The O2 sat was solid at 96%. She logged her observations in the electronic chart with the kind of detail that should have remained invisible but wouldn't, because in 3 minutes Dr. Hargrove would review these notes and see what he always saw in her work, a threat. Dr. Richard Hargrove stood at the nurse's station when she returned her cart to the supply room, his tailored white coat falling perfectly from his shoulders, the kind of coat worn by men who believed fabric quality reflected moral character. His Rolex caught the light as he reviewed Sergeant Major Roberts' billing codes, standard post-op, 2 nights monitoring, phantom physical therapy session that never happened, and a phantom respiratory consultation that would bill his insurance company for $840. The scheme had been running for 14 months. Hargrove had netted $237,000 in that time, dividing the fraudulent charges across 63 patient charts, each one carefully selected, each one too injured or medicated to remember details. Sarah's methodical charting was becoming a problem. He'd noticed it 2 months ago when she'd questioned why a patient post-cardiac ablation had been billed for a second echocardiogram that didn't appear in the medical record. She'd asked it politely, deferentially, the way nurses ask questions when they're not entirely sure they're allowed to. "Just checking the chart, doctor. Making sure the codes match the documentation." He'd smiled and explained the echo had been ordered but cancelled, a simple administrative oversight, nothing to concern herself with. She'd nodded and moved on, but she'd also hand-audited 3 more charts that week and found similar discrepancies in 5 of them. The problem with nurses like Sarah Chen was that they had the kind of minds that noticed patterns, that couldn't let inconsistencies slide, that asked quiet questions in ways that could eventually snowball into big ones. The kind of minds that made uncomfortable audit trails. He'd watched her work for months now, the careful documentation, the cross-reference billing codes, the way she'd started to avoid the break room because his friends in administration needed deniability. She was competent in a way that was becoming dangerous. He watched her now from across the nurses' station, this small Asian woman in her late 40s, her dark hair pulled back without vanity, her hands moving through the routine of shift work with the precision of a machine. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't gossip. She didn't drink coffee in the break room with the other nurses, who'd learned through his carefully placed suggestions that associating with her might affect their own employment security. She simply worked, documented everything, and went home to whatever invisible life people like her lived when they weren't busy being thorns in the sides of surgeons who'd earned the right to supplement their income through creative billing. 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial. No friends. No social media footprint. No emergency contact beyond a generic number that rang at a VA facility. She was perfect cover, the kind of nurse who'd never be suspected of anything because she didn't exist outside of work hours, didn't have the kind of life that generated connections or witnesses or complications. She was also exactly the wrong person to have noticed the patterns in his billing codes. He'd already made calls to 3 board members who owed him for covering their own indiscretions, a nepotism hire, a DUI left off the record, a mishandled patient complaint. They'd agreed that if a situation developed, if Sarah Chen became a more direct threat, the hospital had policies. They had ways of handling troublemakers. Hargrove had built his position carefully over 17 years at Oak Creek Memorial, establishing himself as indispensable, the surgeon to whom people owed favors, the physician whose departure would have consequences. Sarah Chen had been at the hospital for 3 years and had nothing. No tenure, no connections, no power base. She was vulnerable in exactly the ways he'd learned to exploit. He looked back at the phantom billing codes on his monitor, confirmed the procedures were coded to different insurance carriers to avoid pattern detection, and smiled. The smile was the kind that would have made apex predators take a step back, the kind that came from someone who'd never encountered a situation he couldn't manipulate. Sarah Chen was planning to be a problem. He was planning to ensure she never got the chance. The intercom crackled again at 031 for hours. A trauma admit was coming in, MVA on Interstate 64, multiple vehicles, estimated time of arrival 8 minutes. Sarah was already in motion before the announcement finished, her hands pulling supplies, her movements precise and purposeful. The night shift trauma run was hers, the work that came when the emergency department needed people who could function on adrenaline and training instead of sleep. She passed Sergeant Major Roberts' room on her way to the trauma bay. He was still sleeping, his breathing steady, his massive hand relaxed on the blanket. She didn't stop. She didn't allow herself to look long enough to see the family resemblance in his jawline, the same set of his shoulders that matched the man she'd named David after but hadn't been allowed to claim. Pausing for that kind of recognition was how you got caught. How you revealed the truth of who you were underneath the carefully maintained fiction. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Dr. Hargrove was already accessing his contact list, mentally cataloguing the leverage he held over various administrators, calculating exactly how many complaints he would need to file before Sarah Chen stopped being a nurse and started being a liability. He was planning her disappearance from Oak Creek Memorial with the same precision she used to chart her patients' vital signs. The trauma bay doors slid open. The smell of diesel fuel and burnt rubber rolled in ahead of the first ambulance. Sarah's mind shifted into the compartment reserved for crisis, and the careful nurse with the covered scars and the faded unit patch folded in her locker became something else entirely, present, deadly, already moving faster than anyone else could follow. The smell of diesel fuel and burnt rubber rolled in ahead of the first ambulance. Sarah's mind shifted into the compartment reserved for crisis, and the careful nurse with the covered scars and the faded unit patch folded in her locker became something else entirely, present, deadly, already moving faster than anyone else could follow. But that wasn't what stopped her cold at 1900 hours when the transfer team wheeled Sergeant Major Roberts through the ER doors with his Marine Honor escort flanking the gurney like sentinels. It was the family contact on the admission sheet. David Chen. Son. Active duty. Her clipboard clattered to the tile floor. The transfer summary showed post-operative monitoring required, Roberts 3 days out from chest surgery at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, stable vitals, routine recovery trajectory. Routine. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the clipboard, but not from fear. From something deeper. Something she'd spent 3 years training herself not to feel. David's letters. The ones Robert sent her monthly, updates on her son's progress through boot camp, his promotion to Lance Corporal, the day he qualified expert marksman, a connection to her child that the Pentagon's erasure order had made impossible any other way. Roberts had been the lifeline. And now he was here. In her hospital. On her floor. She was still reading the contact information when Dr. Hargrove materialized beside her with the precision of a predator closing distance. Not you, Nightingale. His voice carried the practiced contempt of someone accustomed to obedience. I need actual professionals on military cases. Sarah straightened. I'm assigned to room 347, Dr. Hargrove. It's my. You're assigned to whatever I say, and right now that's the supply closet inventory. He stepped closer, deliberately positioning himself so Robert's wife and 2 daughters could see him through the doorway. His voice climbed. I've reviewed your work, and frankly I'm concerned about your judgment. Sergeant Major Roberts deserves competence. The words landed like shrapnel. Sarah's jaw clenched, controlled, almost invisible, but Hargrove's smile widened because he saw it. He always saw the moments when she fought not to respond. Your medication error last week could have killed someone, he continued, loud enough for 3 nurses at the med station to freeze. Or did you forget to document that too? There had been no error. Sarah's charting was meticulous, forensic in its precision. But documentation could be altered. Files misplaced. A single incident report added to a personnel file was enough to plant doubt, and doubt was a weapon Hargrove wielded like an artist. Linda from oncology actually mouthed sorry while gathering her lunch. The entire break room emptied within 30 seconds when Sarah sat down at 1,245 hours. She'd lasted 90 seconds before she was alone with her sandwich and the hum of the refrigerator. The fabricated write-up appeared on the unit board at 1,430 hours, pinned prominently under the red disciplinary actions header, Chen, medication administration protocol violation under review. Sarah stood in front of it for 4 seconds. Her colleagues pretended not to watch. The hallway traffic flowed around her like water around a stone, nobody made eye contact, nobody offered explanation, nobody acknowledged that they all knew it was a lie. The hospital had its own hierarchy of fear, and Hargrove's reach extended through every department. Associate yourself with Sarah Chen and you'd find yourself on the wrong side of the schedule, audit targets, letters to your supervisors about concerning patterns in clinical judgment. She took one measured breath. The kind that comes from muscle memory, from training that lives deeper than conscious thought. She wiped away the single tear that escaped without breaking eye contact with Hargrove across the hallway. Her voice was steady as steel. Quiet. The kind of quiet that made the fluorescent light seem louder by contrast. I've survived worse interrogations than your insecurities, Doctor. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. His smile vanished. Then returned twice as cold. Clock's ticking, Sarah. People are talking. He leaned in, voice low enough that only she could hear. How long do you think you last when nobody will work with you? He walked away before she could answer. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing he was right. Isolation in a hospital wasn't an inconvenience. It was a system failure waiting to happen. A single critical moment where backup didn't arrive. Where eyes weren't watching. Where a medication dose got pulled without verification. And everyone knew it. Sarah returned to the med-surg floor at 1,600 hours, deliberately assigned away from the ICU where Roberts recovered. Her hand stayed steady. Her charting stayed perfect. She moved through the shift like someone who'd already accepted the outcome, the way soldiers move into impossible positions, present, functional, disconnected from the fear running underneath. The alarms came at 0247 hours. 3 of them, layered and screaming through the walls, the particular pattern that meant cardiac crisis. Code blue, ICU. She heard it through 2 sets of double doors, through the sound-dampening walls, through the late-night quiet that made every noise seem amplified. Code blue, room 347. Sarah's feet moved before her brain caught up. She wasn't assigned. She wasn't cleared. The call bell was ringing in room for 18 and she was supposed to respond there, but her body had already made the decision that her mind wasn't permitted to make. The compartment opened again, the one that held the emergency protocols that civilian nursing didn't teach, the procedures you learned in places that officially never existed, the speed that came from having held lives together under fire. Room 347 was chaos trying to be controlled. Roberts grey and gasping, his chest drain clogged, a thick, dark clot blocking the lumen, blood backing up into his chest cavity, his heart compressed like a fist in a vice. Cardiac tamponade. The attending surgeon was still arriving, the resuscitation tray unopened on the bedside table. The night intensivist stood frozen like he was watching a problem in a textbook instead of a man dying. Dr. Hargrove was there, still in street clothes from a late dinner at some restaurant that probably had a wine list longer than the hospital's pharmacy inventory. "Get cardiothoracic surgery," he said, still frozen. "Get the crash cart." "There's no time," Sarah said. Not a question. Not a request. Statement of fact. He needs pericardiocentesis now or he's dead in 3 minutes. You're not qualified to. But Sarah was already gloved. Already moving. The 18-gauge needle in her left hand, the syringe in her right, her fingers positioning the approach at the subxiphoid angle while her eyes tracked the cardiac monitor. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint. It was the muscle memory of a woman who'd performed this procedure in field hospitals with mortar fire close enough to shake the canvas, under the kind of pressure that made civilian medicine feel almost leisurely by comparison. She entered below the xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle, angling toward the left shoulder, watching the deflection in the monitor for the moment when the needle touched the pericardium. The attending surgeon arrived and stopped moving. He watched her aspirate. 50 cc's of dark blood flowed into the syringe with a sound like relief, the hiss of pressure releasing, the sound of a man's heart suddenly able to beat again. Roberts gasped air like a drowning man surfacing. His eyes fluttered open and locked onto Sarah's face for one moment of confused recognition before the sedative took him under. The surgeon nodded slowly. His eyes, the kind that had seen enough trauma to recognize another trauma surgeon, looked at Sarah's hands. At the precision of her angle. At the fluid certainty of her movements. That was, he said quietly, battlefield precision. Hargrove heard it. Sarah watched his face recalculate, watched the moment when he realized that the quiet night nurse he was dismantling had just demonstrated a level of clinical competence that didn't match anything in her personnel file or her credentials or her carefully constructed cover story. The monitors stabilized. Robert's oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 72 to 82 to 89. His heart rate steadied from the panicked rhythm of a man suffocating into something approaching normal. Sinus rhythm. The mechanical breathing took over, the ventilators hiss a sound like victory. Sarah stepped back. She didn't meet Hargrove's eyes. She didn't acknowledge the surgeon's nod or the resident's stunned expression. She simply removed her gloves, the snapping sound crisp as gunfire in the quiet, and walked out of room 347. Behind her, she heard Hargrove's voice, low and dangerous. "We'll talk about this, Sarah. About where you got that training." She didn't turn around. Didn't break stride. Didn't give him anything to work with. But as she walked back to MedSurg, back to the fluorescent hallways and the machines that beeped in patterns designed to be background noise, she understood something that Hargrove was only beginning to realize. The isolation he'd created, the wall of fear and retaliation he'd built around her, those things had just become irrelevant. Because a single moment under pressure had revealed something he couldn't afford for anyone else to know. A secret, once seen, couldn't be unseen. And she had 17 hours before Hargrove figured out what to do about it. The cardiac monitors screamed at 02 for 7 hours. 3 alarms, synchronized, their electronic wail cutting through the ICU's midnight quiet like shrapnel through silence. Sarah heard them from MedSurg 3 floors below, that particular frequency, that urgent staccato rhythm that meant tamponade, meant fluid crushing the heart, meant minutes. She knew without being told. Sergeant Major Roberts. The night shift noise around her, the creaking gurneys, the ventilator wheeze from room for 12, the fluorescent buzz overhead, all of it faded into background static. Her feet moved before her brain caught up. Muscle memory. The same muscle memory that had moved her hands through 47 combat surgeries in a field hospital that officially never existed. "Where are you going?" The MedSurg charge nurse, Jenkins, looked up from her computer. 2,307 hours of accumulated exhaustion in her eyes. ICU. Now. Sarah was already moving toward the stairwell. "Hargrove said you don't go to ICU. Direct orders. You stay on this floor." Sarah didn't break stride. The stairwell door swung open. Down 3 flights. Her shoes, regulation hospital issue but worn down at the heels like combat boots, hit the concrete steps with precise rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Military cadence. The door burst open onto the ICU corridor. Hargrove stood frozen outside Robert's room, his hands hanging at his sides like they'd forgotten their purpose. Behind him, the attending surgeon, Dr. Mitchell, 15 years experience, 3 published papers on cardiac trauma, was frozen too. On the monitor above Robert's bed, the rhythm deteriorated. BP dropping. O2 sat falling. The hiss of air escaping from his lungs with every shallow breath. Pericardiocentesis. Sarah's voice was level. Flat. A statement, not a question. Needle. Now. "Nurse Chen, you're not." Hargrove's protest died in his throat. She was already moving. The crash cart. The 18-gauge needle, no, smaller, a 20-gauge, fluid aspiration not blood withdrawal, in her hands with the precision of someone who'd done this under fire, literally under fire, with rounds impacting corrugated metal walls and screams from the next tent. Her fingers found the landmarks on Robert's chest. The angle of Louis. The 5th intercostal space. The needle went in. The hiss. The blessed, life-giving hiss of air escaping. Fluid dark as old copper draining from the needle hub into the syringe. 20 ccs. 30. Robert's oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 75. 82, 88. The monitor rhythm steadied. Sinus. Beautiful, perfect sinus rhythm. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. His eyes found hers, really found hers, looking at her for the first time as something other than the night shift nurse who restocked for trays, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition. Not of her name. Of her hands. Hands steady as surgical laser. Hands that had held lives together in conditions that would make most surgeons weep. "Where did you learn to do that?" His voice was a whisper. Sarah was already moving to the monitor, documenting the procedure time, the fluid volume, the stabilization. 12 years of critical care. 2 tours overseas. She paused, looked at Robert's face. His breathing easier now. His color returning from that terrible gray-white to something that resembled a living human being. He'll need echo to rule out recurrence. Pericardial window if the fluid returns. You should be in surgery, Mitchell said. You should be running this unit. She said nothing. That was the answer that mattered more than any words. Hargrove's phone was in his hand before she reached the ICU exit. His face had gone the color of old parchment, that particular shade of white that comes when a carefully constructed fiction suddenly cracks. When a threat you thought you'd contained suddenly reveals you never contained it at all. By 0300 he was making the first call. By 0315, the second. By 0330, the third. Margaret? It's Richard. I need to discuss something sensitive about a staff member. Yes, the hospital board meeting this Thursday. I'd like to bring it to personnel committee. There's a nurse on my unit, Sarah Chen, and I've identified some concerning gaps in her clinical decision-making. His voice in the hallway outside the doctor's lounge was smooth, rehearsed, the voice of a man who'd practiced this narrative. I'm concerned she's practicing beyond her scope. I want to make sure the board is aware before we have a liability situation. Margaret was board chair. Margaret also had a daughter-in-law with a prescription pill problem that Hargrove had quietly helped manage without reporting to the licensing board. Insurance fraud was a grey area. Helping someone stay employed while abusing controlled substances was a much darker grey. Margaret owed him. Of course I'll document it properly, he continued. But I wanted to give you a heads up. Between us. The second call went to Patterson. Board member Patterson. Whose boundary violation, crossing lines with a patient, the kind of thing that ended careers, had somehow disappeared from his file 18 months ago, just before his board nomination. Hargrove's personal connection in the hospital legal department had made that problem vanish like it never existed. Patterson? Richard Hargrove. Listen, I need your discretion on something. I'm seeing some clinical judgment issues with one of my nurses that I need investigated quietly. I don't want to cause a panic, but I also don't want to ignore potential patient safety concerns. Can I count on your support if this goes to the board? Patterson said yes. Of course he said yes. Patterson's career existed in the narrow space between his competence and Hargrove's silence. The third call went to board member Yu. Yu, whose son had gotten drunk at the country club, gotten behind the wheel, and gotten caught doing 84 in a 55 with a .2 blood alcohol level. Hargrove's brother-in-law, the district attorney, had made that arrest disappear. Not just dismissed, erased. Like it never happened. Yu's son was drinking at the same country club last Saturday. Yu, it's Richard. I'm sorry to call so late. I have a situation with nursing staff that I need the board to take seriously. I'm bringing in an external reviewer to audit the charts. I wanted to prepare you so there are no surprises at Thursday's meeting. By 0345, Hargrove had pivoted. The calls had done their work, 3 board members now primed, now obligated, now understanding that supporting him on this patient safety review was the price of their own secret staying buried. But he needed more. He needed doubt. Real doubt. The kind that would make any institutional investigation conclude that Sarah Chen was a liability, competent but reckless, a threat to the hospital's reputation. He emailed at 0347, forwarding the contact information for Sarah's supposedly former employers. Her nursing school in California. Her previous hospital in San Diego. Both fabricated. Both fictional. Both carefully constructed on the false background that existed in official records. We're conducting a thorough background verification and quality review of Ms. Chen's clinical credentials and care practices. We would appreciate your candid assessment of her work history, any concerns about judgment or scope, and any incident reports we should know about. The responses would come back negative because those institutions didn't exist. That's how the pattern worked. That's how doubt became narrative. That's how a fabricated past became institutional fact. By 0600, Hargrove had brought in Karen Voss. External clinical reviewer. The kind of consultant who specialized in finding exploitable gaps in nursing documentation. The kind of person who could spend 3 weeks reviewing Sarah's charts and find exactly what someone paid her to find. I'm concerned about clinical decision-making patterns, Hargrove told her over encrypted email. Look particularly at her responses to physician orders, especially mine. I want to understand if there's a pattern of task creep or scope violation. He was building the case. Layer by layer. Board members locked in by mutual obligation. References that would fail. An investigator looking for specific patterns. By Thursday, it would be airtight. Sarah arrived for her 1900 shift at 18:59, 5 minutes early like always, her badge already in her hand. The badge scanner at the employee's entrance had that slight hesitation it always did, the kind of hesitation that felt like the building itself was deciding whether to let her through. This time it didn't beep. This time it went red. The security guard, Martinez, who'd worked nights for 7 years, who'd always nodded at her with the kind of respect that came from someone who recognized competence even if he couldn't name it, was standing by the entrance. His expression had changed. Professional. Institutional. The expression of someone following orders that made him uncomfortable. Miss Chen, I need your badge, please. I'm here for my shift. You're on administrative suspension pending investigation. Dr. Hargrove's orders came down at 0600. We need the badge, and I need to walk you back to your vehicle. The badge dropped from her fingers. She watched it fall toward Martinez's palm like it was happening to someone else. Watch the security badge, the thing that meant access, meant capability, meant presence, land with a small plastic click in his hand. Investigation of what? Her voice was steady. The voice of someone who'd asked this question before, in different rooms, with different people, in different languages. The voice of someone already knowing the answer wouldn't be the truth. Patient care quality review. Dr. Hargrove's concerned about some documentation issues. Your attorney can call personnel. But she wasn't listening anymore. Through the glass doors of the emergency entrance, she could see the ICU corridor. Robert's room. His family was arriving, his daughter, his grandson, the weight of his mortality being held in the faces of the people who loved him. She could see the monitor from here. Stable. The rhythm holding. She didn't know if he'd coded again after she left. She didn't know if her hands had bought him enough time, or if the next crisis would come when there was no one standing outside a frozen Dr. Hargrove to recognize what needed to be done. She didn't know if Sergeant Major Roberts' commanding officer had called David. If her son, her boy in the Marine dress uniform, was sitting in his barracks right now wondering why the hospital suddenly wouldn't let his mother's colleague call him back. The drive home was silent except for the rain starting, light at first then heavier, hammering the windshield like someone angry at the glass. The words from 2006 echoed in the empty car, the words that had sent her to ground, that had buried her under false credentials and midnight shifts and a night where she learned the meaning of invisibility. You were never in Tikrit. The operation never happened. If you surface, we cannot protect you. She believed them. She'd kept the bargain. Now she understood they'd never had any intention of protecting her anyway. By morning, the suspension letter was official. Sarah signed it at 0615 without reading past the first paragraph, administrative leave pending investigation, ID badge confiscated, no access to patient records, no contact with staff. The security guard who escorted her from the building didn't make eye contact. He'd handed her the box for her locker contents the same way a pallbearer carries a casket. Her apartment was silent that night. 3 years of 12-hour shifts, of charting every medication, every vital sign, every moment of care with the precision of someone trained to document under fire, and it ended with a cardboard box and a parking lot walk in the pre-dawn dark. She sat on her couch staring at nothing. Roberts was still in recovery. She had no way of knowing if he'd survived. David hadn't called. The military orders echoed in her mind the way they always did when she let her guard drop, words spoken by a colonel whose rank had been redacted from the paperwork. you were never in Tikrit. The operation never happened. If you surface, we cannot protect you. They'd been clear about that. Protection was a courtesy extended only while she remained invisible. 3 days later, Sarah sat in a plastic chair bolted to the floor in the Hampton VA Medical Center waiting room, surrounded by men her hands had once saved. A Marine with a prosthetic right leg below the knee sat 2 chairs down, reading a magazine from 2019. An Army sergeant with shrapnel scars that mapped across his neck like a topographic nightmare filled out forms with a ballpoint pen that kept running out of ink. She recognized the scar pattern, an IED blast, fragmentation radius about 12 meters. She'd treated identical wounds in a field hospital that officially never existed, had held pressure on arteries while concussions from mortars shook dirt into open abdomens, had worked 72 hours without leaving the surgical suite because there were too many patients and not enough hands. The waiting room smelled like industrial floor cleaner and the particular stale coffee that only Veterans Affairs could produce. Her prescription was for anxiety medication. The irony was not lost on her. 5 milligrams of something that didn't touch the real problem. The real problem wasn't anxiety. It was the weight of knowing things that couldn't be acknowledged, holding a rank that didn't officially exist, watching people you trained die in conflicts your government wouldn't name. Her phone had buzzed that morning with an HR email. Report to Oak Creek Memorial at 0900 tomorrow to retrieve personal belongings. Not to discuss her case. Not for a meeting. Retrieve belongings. In hospital language, that was a termination notice dressed in bureaucratic neutrality. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment in a converted farmhouse on the outskirts of Norfolk, the kind of place where nobody asked questions about a single woman who kept irregular hours. She stared at the only photograph she'd ever allowed herself to keep, David at boot camp graduation, standing in dress blues beside Sergeant Major Roberts, both of them grinning with the particular confidence of men who believed they were invincible. She'd never attended that graduation. Officially, she didn't exist as his mother, just a distant aunt who sent cards on birthdays and never appeared in family photos. The jacket hung on the back of her chair. The tear in the lining had grown slightly, 3 inches now, exposing the unit patch underneath. The patch itself was faded almost to invisibility, the medical caduceus wrapped in crossed rifles barely visible against the aged fabric. One word stitched around the border, Athena. That was her call sign. That was who she'd been when she had the authority to save lives without asking permission, when her hands moving at speed meant men went home to their families instead of going home in flag-folded boxes. She'd earned 3 Navy Crosses for 47 combat surgeries performed in 72 hours while RPG fire shook the building and mortars walked their way down the street outside. Those medals existed in Pentagon files marked classified. They would never be worn. Never be displayed. Never be publicly acknowledged by the nation that had demanded she perform them. Now she was fired from a night shift nursing job by a doctor who froze when the real emergency came. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 0855 in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray sweater, the jacket with the torn lining. Security escorted her to administration, but they didn't stop at the HR office on the 3rd floor. They bypassed it entirely and walked her to the executive conference room on the 4th floor. She felt her pulse steady, that particular calm that came from having already survived the worst. Whatever was about to happen, it couldn't kill her. She'd already died in Tikrit. The security guard opened the conference room door. Sergeant Major Roberts sat at the head of the table in a wheelchair, his left side still bearing the shallow dressing from the chest drain. And 4 poles stood beside him like a chrome sentinel. His eyes were clear. Alert. Alive. Sarah's breath caught, not a flinch, just a brief pause in oxygen intake that she covered by stepping fully into the room. The hospital administrator stood by the window, wringing his hands. Behind her, in marine dress blue so crisp they could cut glass, stood David. Her son. 23 years old, staff sergeant insignia, eyes locked on her face with an expression somewhere between shock and recognition of a truth he'd only half suspected his entire life. Robert's voice was rough from intubation. I told them I wouldn't leave this facility until I met the doctor who saved my life. Sarah said nothing. Her hands were steady at her sides. They kept saying nurse. But I know what I saw. Robert's eyes tracked to the tear in her jacket lining, where the unit patch showed through. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Athena. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights hummed their low electrical frequency. Nobody breathed. David stepped forward, his voice cracking on every word. Senior Chief Petty Officer. A pale woman from medical records entered, a thick file trembling in her hands. She'd been crying. Sarah Chen. United States Navy, Shadow Surgical Unit, Tikrit, 2006. She read from the Pentagon documentation like someone delivering a death notification. 3 Navy crosses. The administrator's face had gone the color of drywall. The door opened again. A Navy SEAL team leader in a flight suit still creased from an overnight flight sat down across from Roberts. Lieutenant Commander Price, his nameplate read. The kind of calm that came from men who'd trained to operate in spaces where everything could kill you, where fear was just data to process. She performed 47 combat surgeries in 72 hours under sustained enemy fire. Half the operators in JSOC owe their lives to her team. Roberts gripped the wheelchair arms. 11 Marines from my platoon survived an ambush. An active engagement. Your team operated in a building that was taking RPG fire from the objective. Sarah's eyes met his. She didn't nod. She didn't confirm. She simply held his gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who had already paid for those lives with pieces of herself she would never recover. The door opened a third time. A woman in a dark suit, FBI credentials visible on her belt. Special Agent Morrison. 40 years old, the kind of competence that came from 2 decades of federal work. We've been investigating Dr. Hargrove's insurance fraud for 6 months. Phantom procedures billed to veteran accounts. $217,000 identified so far. She opened her own file. Your chart notes are perfect. Every discrepancy documented. Every inconsistency flagged. Perfect evidence trail. Sarah said nothing. You created that accidentally, Morrison continued. Just by doing your job. Just by caring enough to notice. Dr. Hargrove stood in the back corner of the conference room, the color draining from his face in real time. His mouth opened and closed. No words came. He looked like a man watching his life transform into something unrecognizable. Roberts leaned forward slightly, pain flashing across his face. The movement had cost him. But his voice was steady. You saved my life 3 days ago. Again. Sarah's eyes remained on his. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the deferential tone she'd used at Oak Creek Memorial. This was the voice that had issued commands in a surgical suite under fire, the voice that had authority written into its timbre. You survived, Sergeant Major. That was the objective. Senior Chief, David said softly. The way he said it, not a question, not even a greeting. A recognition. An acknowledgement of the person he'd always known existed somewhere just outside his ability to reach her. Sarah turned to look at her son. The composure didn't crack. The professional mask stayed in place. But something in her eyes shifted, a light coming on in a room that had been dark for 23 years. She didn't embrace him. There wasn't time for that kind of vulnerability. But she nodded, slow and deliberate. One senior chief to a Marine who had been born into a war his mother couldn't acknowledge fighting. Morrison closed her file. I believe you're officially cleared to return to work, Senior Chief Chen. As soon as you're ready. But Sarah wasn't looking at the FBI agent. She was looking at the door where Hargrove had been standing. He was gone. Just the smell of his cologne lingering in the conference room like a ghost of a man who'd already stopped existing. The FBI agent opened a folder, and the sound of paper sliding across polished wood was deliberate, a choice, not an accident. Agent Morrison's face held the flat expression of someone who'd delivered worse news to worse people, but the folder itself trembled slightly in his weathered hands. Dr. Hargrove has been billing phantom procedures to veterans' insurance for 3 years, Morrison said, each word landing like a hammer strike against anvil. Post-surgical complications that never happened. Extended care never provided. Consultations that occurred only on paper. The conference room air seemed to thicken, oxygen somehow harder to find. Board member Patterson's face drained of color, not pink to white, but white to the pale gray of a man watching his retirement disappear. "We voted to terminate her based on your recommendation," Patterson whispered, the sentence fracturing on itself. Morrison didn't look away from Hargrove. "Based on fabricated disciplinary reports. The medication error that cost her the suspension, we have pharmacy logs documenting every narcotic, every antibiotic, every push dose from her entire shift. Nothing missing. Nothing unaccounted for." The administrator's pen stopped mid-note. "The clinical investigator you hired arrived at her findings this morning. She examined 42 patient charts under Nurse Chen's care. Found nothing wrong with her clinical documentation. Nothing wrong with her patient outcomes." Morrison opened the folder wider, and photographs spilled out, invoices, insurance claims, billing codes flagged in red. "But we found 17 billing irregularities in cases Dr. Hargrove personally managed. 17 procedures billed that have no corresponding operative notes, no anesthesia records, no surgeon's confirmation." Hargrove's voice emerged thin, cracking like old paint. "This is a misunderstanding. I can explain." Lieutenant Commander Price, the SEAL team leader who'd flown in overnight with a folder of his own, leaned forward with the terrifying calm of someone accustomed to making decisions while rounds of gunfire impacted around him. "You tried to fire a decorated combat veteran for being too competent at her job," Price said, his voice steady as a sniper's breathing. "You froze during a cardiac emergency while she saved a Marine's life. And then you suspended her so she couldn't check on her patient." David stood beside him in dress blues that hung on his frame like he'd grown into them only yesterday, his voice carrying the knife-edge precision of his mother's own authority now. "Her patient who's also my commanding officer. Who trained me while she wasn't allowed to contact me because her service record was classified." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the fluorescent light above them humming its electronic dirge, a sound nobody notices until it's the only thing left to listen to. The administrator's hand shook as she slid a termination letter across the table, and this time it faced Hargrove's chair. "Effective immediately, pending criminal investigation," she said, the words formal as a verdict. Hargrove's expensive watch, the Omega that had cost more than 3 months of Sarah's salary, caught the fluorescent light one final time as his hands reached for the box that security placed in front of him with deadpan symmetry. The same guard who'd escorted Sarah out 3 days ago, who'd carried her personal belongings past colleagues too afraid to meet her eyes, now stood with the same neutral expression and said the words that ended everything, "I believe you know the way out, sir." Hargrove's hands trembled as he reached for the box. Trembled. The man who'd constructed an entire professional edifice on the foundation of crushing people smaller than himself now couldn't steady his own fingers. He stood, the chair scraping backward with a sound like bones breaking, and walked toward the door with shoulders that had somehow become narrower. Patterson wouldn't look at him. The administrator stared at her desk. Only Price watched him leave, and the weight of that attention seemed to bend the air itself. 6 months dissolved into medical records and legal proceedings and bureaucratic machinery grinding forward with the inexorable patience of institutions protecting their own. Sarah stood at Camp Lejeune in dress Navy uniform, the ribbons on her chest finely visible in daylight where they belonged, 3 Navy crosses arranged in the order they'd been earned, each one a 72-hour span of standing over open body cavities with bullets snapping overhead and hands that moved because hands had to move or people died. 2 silver stars occupied the space below them. The Purple Heart wore the ribbon like a minor honor compared to what it represented, a shrapnel wound taken when she'd refused to leave a soldier who still had a pulse. Sergeant Major Roberts was being promoted to Sergeant Major of Marine Forces Command, the ceremony taking place on the parade ground where the North Carolina sun beat down like judgment, and he'd insisted Sarah attend as an honored guest. Not as a nurse. As a witness. As a senior chief petty officer whose service record had been partially declassified, carefully redacted but officially acknowledged. David stood beside her in his own dress blues, the uniform fitting him properly now, and for the first time since she'd entered the hospital 3 years ago, he could stand beside his mother in public without pretending they were strangers. Roberts finished his speech and looked directly at Sarah across the assembled ranks of Marines. "The bravest warriors I've known carried stethoscopes, not guns," he said, his voice carrying to the back rows. "They ran toward fire when everyone else ran away, and they never asked for recognition." The Marines stood motionless, 250 of them in perfect formation, and every single one of them understood he was talking about a woman in a Navy dress uniform whose call sign had been Athena and whose reputation in the classified world existed in whispered stories that would never appear in any official history. After the ceremony, Lieutenant Commander Price approached Sarah with another folder, thinner than Morrison's had been but somehow weightier. 17 veterans are receiving refunds, Price said. $18,000 each, compensated for procedures they were billed for but never received. Hargrove pleaded guilty this morning. Avoided trial. Sarah nodded, the information processing into the space where vengeance lived but found it oddly empty. She'd imagined this moment 3 days ago when she sat in that VA waiting room, imagined the satisfaction of watching him fall. Hadn't imagined that it would taste like loss instead. The drive back to Norfolk took her through a strip mall on the outskirts of Rocky Mount, the kind of place that collected businesses that had nowhere else to go. And there, behind a folding table with a banner reading supplemental insurance plans in font that looked purchased from a discount office supply store, was Dr. Hargrove. His expensive watch was gone, replaced with a black plastic digital that probably cost $14 at any pharmacy. His surgeon's coat had given way to a polo shirt with a company logo embroidered across the chest. The man who'd controlled hospital boards and manipulated insurance protocols now sat alone at a table in a mostly empty parking lot, trying to convince people buying groceries to upgrade their coverage. A woman approached him, asked a question he couldn't answer with confidence, and she walked away. He didn't follow her. He just sat there, rearranging his pamphlets with the repetitive precision of someone with no other purpose left to occupy his hands. Sarah didn't stop the car. Didn't feel anything except the weight of the moment passing. Justice felt different than she'd expected, less like vindication and more like the simple resolution of an equation. He'd chosen this. Every degradation he delivered to her was simply rerouting backward now, following the law of physics that governs consequences. What went down eventually came back up. The torn jacket, the one Hargrove had mocked, the one she'd worn for 3 years as camouflage, was properly repaired now. The faded unit patch that had been sewn inside the lining was visible on the outside where it belonged, where David could see it and begin to understand what his mother had done in those years she couldn't be his mother. The 2D Force Reconnaissance Company patch now sat over her heart, a permanent statement that she'd belonged to something classified and essential and absolutely real. Sarah's hands didn't shake anymore. They moved with the precision they'd been trained to move with, each gesture purposeful, nothing wasted. The hospital had offered her the position of Nursing Director of Emergency Services, the whole department under her command, salary and authority and vindication wrapped into a single envelope of institutional recognition. She was considering the VA hospital instead, the one where she'd sat in that waiting room 3 days ago, surrounded by veterans she'd treated in conditions no one acknowledged. 18 of them recognized her across 3 days of visits, and each one of them, the amputees, the ones with PTSD that made sleep impossible, the ones who still dreamed in Arabic and gunfire, each one of them needed someone who understood what it meant to run toward fire and carry people out of it. Either way, she was done hiding. Done moving through the world like a ghost. The invisible nurse at Oak Creek Memorial was extinct. What had emerged wore her uniform in the daylight and answered to her name and stood beside her son without apology. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Sometimes they wear scrubs and move through hospital corridors at 0300 hours, and it takes 3 years and an FBI investigation and a SEAL team flying in overnight before anyone thinks to ask what they're actually made of. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the people who save lives when nobody's watching. Like this video if you believe that true heroes don't need headlines. And comment below, have you ever been completely wrong about someone?